Good morning from Chicago, Illinois, and welcome to our wonderful audience from the Forward and from J Street for our Live from the DNC panel, brought to you both by the Forward and by J Street. We have already been through the first day of the convention here. It was incredible. Issues related to Israel and Palestine are definitely in the air, and we're going to be discussing a little bit about the vibe in the room and the vibe outside the room. And it feels that our conversation on these topics of the impact of Israel and the war on the election, what the election's impact might be on the war, it's all very timely because negotiations are literally in midstream right now in the Middle East, and Secretary of State Blinken is in Doha today, having been in Israel yesterday. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the impact specifically of the shift from Biden to Harris. We'll see what that might do. How are Democratic candidates balancing competing interests within the party? So there are some major issues to be discussed, and I'm joined by two incredible experts, wonderful friends, longtime friends. Jim Gerstein to my right, which perhaps on the screen is to your left, I'm not sure. Jim is a pollster and a leading public opinion expert, both nationally, politically, as well as on American Jewish opinion. Folks involved in J Street know that Jim has done our election night polling for the last 8 election cycles, and we are looking forward to looking into these numbers again in November with you. And to my left, and perhaps your right on screen, is Jody Rudorin, and please pronounce her name correctly because I often get it wrong. It's Rudorin, and Jody and I have known each other since you were the bureau chief for the New York Times in Jerusalem. And now she is the editor-in-chief of the Forward, which is the national newspaper of record of the Jewish community. And so
we've known each other longer than that, Jeremy. We've known each other for 20 years, since my last time covering a political convention when I was covering Howard Dean and then John Kerry in 2003 and 2004, and you were the policy director for Howard Dean.
Exactly. Did we go back to New York City politics before that even?
I don't think so. I think we met on the Dean bus.
Campaign. All right, there you go. And what a bus it was. It was quite a wild time. But presidential campaigns are a lot of fun, and so are conventions. And so it's great to be here. I'm sorry to say that we do not have Susan Wild with us because the flights into Chicago have been really messed up by the hurricane, and there was tremendous rains and all that. And so she is sitting literally on a plane right now. So we will have to make do with just the two of you and me trying to provide some insights for our wonderful audience. And we're here in the Dykema Law Firm in Chicago, Illinois, and really grateful for hosting us here. And please feel free to put some questions into the chat. We've got a small live audience here with us, and we'll be taking a couple of questions from those in the room. And let's get the conversation going. And I'd like to start, I guess I'll turn to Jody. You were actually in the room last night. And I think it'd be great to just share with the many folks listening in who didn't get to be in the room, although there were a hell of a lot of people in the room. There are also a lot of people not in the room. What was it like in the room? What's the vibe of this whole convention?
So, first of all, it was a long night last night. People waited a long time to get in, and then the program ran behind schedule. There were a lot of speakers. And the vibe in the room, I think, really changed depending on who was at the podium. There was part of the time where some of the journalists were saying, oh, this doesn't feel as kind of excited as the RNC. I was not at the RNC a few weeks ago. But then when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez came in, there was a real eruption in the room. And then when Vice President Harris herself came in, the room truly went wild. That was a surprise. It's unusual for the nominee to actually speak as she did from the floor early before the last night. And then there was a huge warm welcome and response to some of the speakers, including Hillary Clinton, but also Representative Jasmine Crockett from Texas got a really warm reception, and Senator Raphael Warnock as well. And he was doing his Baptist preacher thing for a while. And then, of course, the night's headliner, Joe Biden, although he came on after prime time in the East, which I'm sure was not the Democratic Party's plan, but he got a very long and warm ovation, chants of "We love Joe, thank you, Joe," for a really long time. So it was pretty electric. It was pretty joyful. And Israel and the war played only a very tiny part, which we can talk about.
Yeah,
as
well,
we
I mean,
do
it's
that.
interesting. I mean, who was the first person who mentioned the hostages?
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Who would have thought? She was the first person to mention the war at all. She said very clearly, Kamala Harris will get a ceasefire and bring the hostages home. Those two things paired together. That is the message that they want. Ceasefire and hostages. And the crowd went pretty wild about it. But, you know, this is supposed to be the left-wing leader of the squad that's causing the Democratic Party so many problems. And here she is, right on message, mentioning the hostages. So that was interesting.
So Jim, you actually didn't make it into the hall last night, but you know, you've been around here now for the last 24 hours and your team is here. What are you picking up in terms of the Democratic vibe here in Chicago?
Sure. And before I start, I just got to thank the Forward and J Street for hosting this. And it's so great that what you guys are both doing at the convention, covering it on all these important issues. And J Street's presence in politics is amazing. And what you've done over the last 16 years has been astounding. And so thank you for hosting this.
Thanks, Jim.
In terms of the vibe outside, I do a lot of polls. We're doing about 500 polls this year. And I can say that prior to about 3.5 weeks ago, it was I never was looking forward to getting our polls back. Now we get polls back and it's like you wake up in the morning and you're diving in and it's with enthusiasm and it's exciting. It's a completely different world. And I think what you see outside of the hall, it's the same thing in terms of the campaign culture, the consultants working on these things, the activists, the volunteers. It's just, we've gone from a very tough situation as Democrats to a very exciting situation for Democrats. And it permeates this entire city right now. And this is my 7th convention. They're all exciting. This one is unique because of just the complete turnaround in mood and excitement and the impact that has when you gather 60,000 people together and the energy that produces. And I think this is a critical launching pad for the next phase of the campaign. I mean, we got 3 big days coming up. Last night was a very important kind of closing chapter, and we're now opening up a new chapter in a very, I think, very inspiring way. And we'll see how it is critical now that we're in this really tight election, that this catapults us further, continues the momentum that's grown over the last several weeks, and is the basis for a campaign going forward.
Yeah, I will say that it was really, really depressing to get together with Jim for a social dinner for about 8 months, and I never stopped socializing because I didn't want to hear this. So now we've got to get a dinner on the books because it'll hopefully be a little bit more uplifting.
But the life of a pollster.
Yeah, exactly. We just didn't want to hear from you. We didn't want to know the facts, but now I want to know the facts. What about Jody? I'm curious about the protests. I mean, obviously coming into the convention, my team knows that I was exceedingly cautious and I was worried about what the impact was going to be. Tens of thousands of people potentially really disrupting. What's your sense after day one of what the impact of that is on the overall convention? As a journalist, I mean, what's your take on it?
It's first of all, I'll say we want to know the facts, whatever they are, as journalists, whether they're whatever that. So that's just want to draw that distinction for the audience. It's a really mixed bag, I think, where the protest movement is right now. There was a much smaller turnout at what was supposed to be one of 2 main pro-Palestinian protests yesterday than they had expected. They talked about tens of thousands of people. The estimates are that there were maybe 3,000 people. The night before, there was another protest that was supposed to be about abortion rights and LGBTQ issues, also was kind of about Gaza, very small, I think a few hundred people. So I think that is there's a little bit of a sense of the air is out of the balloon there. At the same time, I would say there are a few other things going on that aren't really officially protests necessarily, but are powerful in the party. First of all, there were protesters who got through the perimeter and caused a security problem last night and were arrested. And then there was a person who brought in a Stop Arming Israel banner, managed to unfurl it in the middle of the United States during Biden's speech. The crowd quickly kind of started chanting, "We love Joe," and held their banners in front of him. They turned the lights down. They took him out of the arena. I don't think that, so they were pretty harsh response to his protest, but there is some stuff inside the arena. And you also definitely see among delegates and inside the arena, a lot of keffiyehs, Palestinian scarves. There's a new scarf that says Democrats for Palestinian Rights. There's a button people are wearing that says ceasefire delegate. And there's a group of these uncommitted delegates. There are 30 of them. 4 of them are Jewish, by the way, and I profiled one of them yesterday, named June Rose. They were elected as delegates to represent the 700,000 people who voted uncommitted in the primaries, primarily motivated by concerns over Biden's prosecution of the war or support of the war. And they are working the convention, trying to get other Harris delegates to kind of buy into the ceasefire now, and actually also calling for an arms embargo. I think that there's a lot of support among the broad stream Democrats, and Jim can tell you how the polls support. Most Democrats want a ceasefire. They want a ceasefire that returns the hostages. They want a ceasefire that leads towards a 2-state solution. I think there is not a lot of broad support for an arms embargo on Israel, and that is part of the uncommitted's agenda. The other big focus for the uncommitted delegates and the uncommitted movement right now is to get the DNC to agree to have a Palestinian American elected official speak from the podium. That has not been announced yet. I would say prospects are fair to middling, maybe lower than that. But I think one of the big questions that Jewish journalists are watching for is, will there be a Palestinian American speaker? Will there be a speaker from some of the hostage families that are here in town for the convention? And how much will Israel and the war even be talked about from the stage? And how I think the DNC is trying very hard to have a balanced approach, as does J Street. And not sure how they're finding it with the audience. There were a lot of cheers, a lot of response every time ceasefire was mentioned last night.
There was another interesting moment, which was Raphael Warnock's speech. If you're in the cheap seats near the stage, you can see the teleprompter, so you know what the person's supposed to be saying.
Yeah.
So you know exactly when they go off script. And Warnock went a little off script and talked about the humanity on both sides, which is, by the way, something that Kamala Harris has also talked about and is core to J Street's messaging. But that was a really interesting moment where, he was going through the agenda of, valuing all people, and he added in Israeli and Palestinian and Gaza, kid in Gaza, kids in Israel. And that was not in his.
So I wrote about that quote and was not in a position at that moment to see the screen and didn't know he had ad-libbed that, but he actually said twice, right? He said poor kids in Israel and poor kids in Gaza. And then he said, I need Israelis and Palestinians both.
You got to join us in the cheap seats.
Yeah.
You get a much more behind the scenes view. It's literally behind the scenes.
What Biden said in his speech about the protesters was a little more towards the messaging that Kamala Harris has had,
Right.
and was a little more sympathetic to the protesters than he has been openly in the past. So, I mean, these are small nuances.
But that's why we're here, is to give our folks the insights, those small nuances they may have missed. Jim, let me shift over to you, and an important aspect of all of this for J Street, and I'm sure for the forward readership, is the impact on the Jewish vote of all of this, and where does the Jewish vote fit into the larger vote? So 2 questions. One, do you believe that there is going to be a shift in the Jewish vote because of these issues, because of some reaction, perhaps against the Democratic Party, against the protests, whatever, in a pro-Republican or pro-Trump way in this cycle? And do you think that this issue has more salience for Jewish voters than it has had in the past? Because those are 2 key things we've discussed every election cycle, that Jews are reliably Democratic at 70+%, and this is not an issue in how they make up their mind. So has that shifted?
So the short answer and the easy answer is no, it hasn't. Now,
Do you have data? Or is that?
I have data, and
Excellent.
I think
You want data, right?
we have a very deep understanding of the Jewish vote going back decades now. And the reason there isn't a big change going on, despite the story that we're going to see on CNN one day or any cable news channel where they're going to pick some voter on some Biscayne Boulevard in South Florida and say how bad Kamala Harris is for Israel and why I'm not. This is the year that the Jews are not going to vote for the Democrats. And we see it every 2 and every 4 years. That same exact story and that same exact story.
And that same woman on.
Generational. But The reason it doesn't change is there are basically some core dynamics when it comes to Jewish voters. And the first is that they share the political beliefs and values of the Democratic Party. This is a very liberal Democratic constituency. And that span, whether that is economic issues, healthcare, or whether that is cultural issues like abortion rights and LGBTQ rights and and guns and the whole range of issues that drive people's sense of political identity and what's important to them. They are firmly aligned with Democrats, and there is a hostility towards the Republicans, and that is the second pillar of understanding the Jewish vote. Most Jews, with the exception of Orthodox Jews, which are about 9% of the Jewish population, are extraordinarily have unbelievably high unfavorable ratings towards the Republican Party, Republican institutions, others, and Donald Trump. But it didn't start with Trump. I mean, his unfavorables are comparable to what George W. Bush's were, because people hated the Iraq War and they didn't like Jesus Day in Texas or whatever. I forgot what the exact holiday that was created there when he was governor. So this hostility is that the Republicans are doing nothing to change that. If anything, every step of MAGA world and Trump, but also the Mitch McConnells and the Marjorie Taylor Greens and all the high profile people in the party do nothing to change Jewish attitudes towards their party. And finally, Israel. Israel is always in the news as this is what Jews vote on and care about. And it's just the second piece of your question. Jews are very emotionally attached to Israel. It is important to them. They care about it. They follow the news. It doesn't translate into them voting on it. Most candidates need to just pass a threshold being sufficiently supportive of Israel. And they do, because most Jews are very liberal on the issues that Israel is wrestling with. And incidentally, they really don't like Benjamin Netanyahu, who's got a favorability and 60% unfavorable rating, starting with when he went after Barack Obama over the Iran agreement. And so, is this going to be the year that person on the street in Florida that is actually a reasonable piece of journalism? No, it's not, because even though October 7th has put Israel in the news and been very painful for Jewish voters, as well as voters across the country, that the core belief about what's going on in Israel, what needs to happen in Israel, hasn't changed. There is concerns about anti-Semitism. That has risen. That is different. But they still believe that Democrats are more likely to fight anti-Semitism than Republicans. So there's a lot of misinformation out there, a lot in terms of what the media is covering, what is prioritized, and just the gap between what they say Jews are thinking and what Jews actually are thinking.
So Jody, I saw you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I have always thought that, right, that the media, the idea that Jews vote on Israel has always been overblown. They don't, because the American Jews are also American. They have a lot of other identities and cares. And we've been watching this particularly since October 7th. Now Israel is a much bigger part of the American political conversation, and the news is much more intense. So how would that affect things? And it seemed like there was maybe going to be a marginal effect in two ways, right? There were two challenges for the Democratic Party in particular. One from the left that was challenging the support of Israel and the Gaza policy, and were they going to lead voters to just not show up or whatever? And then some from the right were there conservative Democrats who really were worried about Israel, who were going to potentially move over to Trump. And it seems to me, and I wonder what you think, Jim, I know you haven't probably had time to pull on this yet, but I feel like the change and the ticket really will affect this small margin in the following way, or this is my hypothesis, which is the biggest chance of actually losing Jewish Democratic voters, which are, by the way, also we should say that Jews are an incredibly reliable voting bloc. They vote in high numbers. But the real thing that was maybe going to lose voters to the Republicans, I think, was a sort of backlash among conservative Democrats who care about Israel against the way the pro-Palestinian left seemed to be having a hold on the Democratic Party, seemed to be taking, the idea of this uncommitted vote, the idea of squad members and others speaking on the floor and using the term genocide, there was like a sense that, oh my God, the Democratic Party is anti-Semitic. And that risked voters, risked losing the kind of independents or really moderate Democratic voters or conservative Democrats. And I feel like the air has gone out of that the extent to which Israel is a genocidal power, is a thing that Democrats can say openly, feels like that's going away somewhat. And therefore, the backlash against that would also go away. So it feels to me like this issue, in terms of actually changing how people vote in November, has probably diminished as the ticket has changed.
I think that there wasn't any evidence that there was real slippage taking place. The bigger dynamic was with young voters and including young Jewish voters, where they.
But that was broader, right? That wasn't just about Gaza.
Exactly. In terms of the broader younger population, Joe Biden was underperforming with young voters and Black voters well before October 7th. Okay, October 7th isn't what triggered any problems that Biden was having with young voters. I see that our J Street U president is our leader is nodding vociferously yes, that this was an issue before October 7th. October 7th, I think, and the war made it more complicated and harder for Biden to dig out of that hole. But what we saw very interesting, all the anger over the war from both directions was aimed at Biden.
Right.
And it wasn't impacting congressional candidates with these constituencies. Senate candidates and congressional House candidates were vastly outperforming Biden. You saw it in all the polls in terms of how are these senators in red states, how's Sherrod Brown and Ruben Gallego and John Tester leading in their races when Biden's losing these states by so much. It's because he was lagging with those core Democratic constituencies, young voters, Black voters, also.
And those are, of course, the constituencies that Kamala Harris's team thinks are particularly motivated for her.
Why did we go from being down 6 in most polls or something to maybe be even up? It's the Democratic constituencies and voters coming back to Kamala Harris. And I think as it relates to Jewish voters, there really wasn't any slippage, but there will be more motivation, more excitement among young voters for Kamala Harris than there were.
I also saw a poll just the other day, sorry, Jeremy, about young voters and how much they care about. I think that middle-aged folks, some of whom may or may not be on this panel, tend to think young voters are all worked up about Israel in a way that is really different from our generation. And I just saw a poll a couple of days ago that said that like something very tiny percentage of them say that the war or Israel is anywhere on their list of voting issues. So it's actually the same dynamic, which is they have a lot of issues, they may have very different views about the war in Gaza than their parents, but they don't rank it high as a motivating factor for voting.
I think you're referring to the Harvard poll. It's like one of the premier polls on young voters. And two things can be true. You can care about an issue and be passionate about it and be voting on something that's affecting you more directly in your daily life. And I think that gets very lost in this entire debate.
Well, I think one of the dynamics, it comes back to like our having dinner together, right? When anybody who is engaged in these issues goes out to dinner, this is all they talk about, right? I mean, it is just amazing how much conversation, how much airtime goes into this. And everybody has a story about that relative or that person that they know who they are sure voted for Biden last time and Trump and Obama back in, the day. And because of Israel, they are now going to not vote for whatever, whether it was Biden or, and I'm curious, you're saying, there's the numbers and there's the facts, and there's nothing to indicate right now that that's in fact a numerically significant thing. But I wanted to go to sort of your more finger on the pulse, the place that you're at as the editor of the Forward. You get a lot of income, right? You get a lot of online comments, you get a lot of emails, you get a lot of op-ed submissions. You get a little bit more of a qualitative feel of that dinner table conversation. And it feels to me that there is a level of agita about whether or not Jews are going to continue to vote Democratic because of this issue that has nothing to do with the numbers, but that agita is there. Do you sense that in your day-to-day engagement with this issue?
Yes, I do, for sure. And I love getting the email, so please keep sending it to me.
You can share your email address.
It's rudoran@forward.com. I respond to all of them. Very proud of that. Anyway, I really think that it's the anti-Semitism that is really behind most of the agita. People are, and I think that anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism are not the same thing, but I do think the Venn diagram, to use the meme of the moment, between them has grown since October 7th. And I think that that is of a deep concern to people, particularly about what they say online or write to me in email, because it's really emotional for them. And I do think there is some number of people, and they are actually quite a range on the political spectrum, for whom this is like a deeply fearful moment. Many of them have kids on college campuses, as does Jim and you, Jeremy, and who are facing different experiences on campus and how the dynamic there feels to them. And people are scared. And there is, by the way, the establishment Jewish leadership of many mainstream big Jewish organizations are not helping in this situation.
They fanning the flames?
They might be fanning the flames. They might be pointing out the most egregious incidents and sending a lot of email and doing a lot of social posting about those things, and not always providing broad context, including polling, or including, like, you see, it's similar to the lady in Biscayne Bay. You saw on CNN this spring, there was like, that you'd see videos of either the one violent incident at a campus protest, or the one kid who couldn't tell you where Gaza was or whatever. There's a lot of attention on these sort of anecdotal things, right? And then when you send reporters out to the campuses, as we did, we sent about a dozen reporters out to different campuses this spring, and really talk to Jewish students on those campuses, they tell you a much more nuanced picture. First of all, some of them tell you that they're very sympathetic with the protesters. Others say they're very frustrated by the litmus testing of both sides, and that they feel like they don't know where to stand because they're not welcome in either space, because they want to talk about the complexity of the situation. And you also hear Jewish students say a lot, like, I wasn't thinking about the protest at all because I had finals. And so I think that some parents who have kids on campus are quite freaked out and scared, and others are like, what I'm seeing on TV is not my kid's experience. So I think, but back to the question of how it might affect the vote, I do think that there is a lot of fear in the community, and a lot of people trying to exploit that fear. And that fear is a very powerful factor that motivates people at the ballot box. When I first became a political reporter 20 some years ago, I got very wise advice, which was the vast majority of people decide how to vote for president based on how they feel economically about their own economic prospects 3 weeks before the election. So how you feel about your own pocketbook in October is the most important thing. But I think that fear is like the second most important thing. And we've seen a lot of campaigns based on fear. Benjamin Netanyahu is a champion of such campaigns. And it's hard to beat fear. So I think that fear of anti-Semitism could affect some number of Jewish votes this fall.
Which of course brings me back to my favorite line from politics, which many people claim to be the parent of, but a campaign based on hope beats a campaign based in fear every time. And it's really important. That is, a Clinton line, it's an Obama line, and, the hope and joy concept that Kamala is introducing. At the end of the day, if Trump is all about fear of American carnage and the, disaster of everything that, he's painting, and you have Kamala painting this forward-looking, hopeful, optimistic, that kind of campaign can win a campaign based on.
Yeah, I mean, I think wins every time is like, tell us. It won for Obama
And Clinton.
and Clinton. It definitely did not. Isaac Herzog, you may remember him. He tried to run a hope against fear, and against Netanyahu didn't work. Maybe that's because the fear in Israel among Israelis is actually like much more real, much more palpable. There is like, actual security threats for them. I think it depends how well you articulate the hope and how realistic the fear is.
So we're about halfway through our conversation. I want to make sure we bring in some of the questions. I'm going to see if anybody in the room wants to ask a question, and then I'm going to also pull in some online question. So think it through and let me know if you want to ask a question. You were going to jump into.
I want to say a quick thing about the anti-Semitism. It's not just anecdotal. I mean, we see it in the data that there is a rising concern among Jewish voters about anti-Semitism. Now, that started with Trump. And we forget right now we're talking about anti-Semitism that seems coming from the left. Yeah, there is a presidential candidate, former president, who has hosts dinners for white supremacists and anti-Semites and who calls Doug Emhoff or acknowledges that he's a crappy Jew and says Jews that aren't going to vote, who are voting for Democrats and don't respect their religion. So there's a lot going on out there. But I don't want to discount. I mean, the concerns over anti-Semitism are genuine in the data and in the community. It is not impacting votes in a bad way for Democrats right now. If you get a chance, I'd be very curious to see how you see it in the J Street community, if it's how people in the J Street community are reacting to what's going on campuses or perceptions of anti-Semitism.
Well, I was going to say, and also, so Biden talked about Charlottesville again last night, as he loves to do, and he talked about Trump. He talked about Trump enabling Nazis and saying there were very fine people on both sides at that rally. And he talked about the bile of anti-Semitism that was akin to the 1930s. And Doug Emhoff is speaking tonight. And Doug Emhoff has been not just on the forefront of the national strategy to counter anti-Semitism, but he has been out there talking about his Judaism and how much he loves Judaism. My friend Adam Nagurny has a piece in the New York Times today about how Doug Emhoff was speaking about his Judaism a week ago. And it's going to be really interesting to see how frontally he talks about it from the main stage. He is, it would be a historic thing for us, a first spouse to be Jewish. And they talked about putting mezuzahs up in the White House and all that kind of thing. And I think one of the questions we all have right now is like exactly how he's going to talk about both his Judaism and anti-Semitism and the war tonight. He has not talked that much about the war. So that'll be one of the main things to be watching tonight.
Right. And I do think for J Street, one of the critical elements of all of this is the definition of anti-Semitism. And you alluded to this Venn diagram, between folks who are anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. Well, there's also the question of when is criticism of policy of the government of Israel not anti-Israel, right? And not anti-Semitism. And there's three circles on the Venn diagram, right? And the most critical circle for J Street is the circle that loves Israel and cares about the country and cares about the people, but thinks the government and the policies and the actions of the government are disserving not only the state of Israel, disserving the Jewish people, disserving the US-Israel relationship. And that's not anti-Israel, that's pro-Israel, to be critical of settlements and to be critical of Ben Gvir and Smotrich and Netanyahu, to be critical of all of these things doesn't even begin to get you into the anti-Israel category. What is anti-Israel? Anti-Israel is a bizarre concept to be anti-country, right? I mean, that somehow this country doesn't deserve to exist. I actually think that 80% of the people that a lot of folks would dismiss as anti-Israel believe Israel should exist as a country that is the national home of the Jewish people. They just think it needs to really radically change what it's doing. And that's not anti-Israel, let alone anti-Semitic. So
right, although, I mean, J Street U kids were some of the, I think, most shocked and traumatized by the anti-Semitism after October 7th. They were people who had been in left-leaning coalitions who were very critical of the government of Israel and who found themselves framed differently by some of the post-October 7th protesters. And some of them, I mean,
Some,
I don't
that's the key.
generalizations, but we interviewed many either actual J Street U activists or people who basically support the J Street position who felt that the world had changed for them in terms of, and what they meant, what they heard from the river to the sea was in a particular way that felt more anti-Semitic than
So we're lucky.
October 7th. We're lucky we have.
We're lucky to have in the room with us one of our leaders in the J Street U movement, and some online probably know the name of Rav Salman because she does a lot of good writing. on this topic for us, and she's at a wonderful university outside of Boston. I believe it's called Tufts, where it just so happens my son who's in the room happens to go. But Mirav, could you just give a little bit of your perspective on that question about the anti-Semitism versus anti-Israel versus criticism?
Sure. I think that the first thing I have to say is claims of anti-Semitism are valid. I will never be the first person in a room to ever tell a student that their experience of anti-Semitism is not valid. However, I guess I'll just say anti-Semitism is differently defined by many students on college campuses. A lot of us have been taught different definitions of anti-Semitism, especially in Hebrew school when we are growing up, which means that a lot of students that I encounter, not only at Tufts, but when I talk to J Street youth leaders across the country, see a Palestinian flag and immediately feel attacked. I'm never going to, invalidate somebody's experience or emotional experience, but that is simply not anti-Semitism. As somebody who grew up in North Carolina who has experienced anti-Semitism, someone who has parents who grew up also experiencing real anti-Semitism at school and in their neighborhoods, that's just not it. Wearing a kufiya is not anti-Semitic inherently. Now, when they say that, when they say the whole thing, I won't even get into it because obviously this is your panel. But I think that there's a real issue with the understanding of what is anti-Semitism and what is it not. But the bigger issue is I don't really want to litigate what is anti-Semitism or what it isn't right now when people are dying and when people are still held hostage. And that's the thing when you all were talking about polling when it comes to young voters. I was kind of shaking my head when you said that you have polling that say that young voters aren't necessarily voting on Israel or Gaza. Maybe they're not, that's not the primary issue, but I think a lot of young voters' values have either changed or become more prominent since this has happened, that have changed the way they approach the ballot box. It actually leads me to a question I have for you guys, if that's possible, which is I've met a lot of students across the country who felt very disillusioned by Biden and were not going to go out and vote, and have recently told me that they are now enlightened to the bigger picture of the fact that we are going to lose our reproductive rights if Trump gets elected, and are now actually, I wouldn't say joyful, but they are ready to go and vote for Kamala Harris. And I'm wondering if you're seeing either qualitatively or quantitatively that kind of, I guess, vibe, or you're seeing that being represented in polling and data from younger voters, especially younger Jewish voters.
Absolutely. Biden was in 2020, Biden won young voters under 30 by around 20 points. And in all the polling up until when he dropped out, he was running even, maybe a point up, a point down with young voters. And we were looking at the data saying, well, this can't be, something's wrong with the data. And you run it back 17 different ways. You're like, it's not wrong. The data isn't wrong. The candidate might have a problem. And, but it preceded October 7th. I take your point that yes, the values and the prominence of the issue, it's there. And it's more front and center. But as you pointed out, abortion rights are affecting people in a very profound way as well. And so Kamala Harris now, the reason she's tied or even ahead in states and in swing states too, one of the key voting blocks that have brought her back to Biden 2020 levels are young voters. And so that's what's happened. And that's I want to add one thing about what you were saying about criticism of the Israeli government policies. What you articulated in the J Street position is the mainstream position in the Jewish world. I mean, if what I'm saying, I may be understating it. 90%. When we have
91, I think 91%.
I mean, it's
an astounding number.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I'm just rounding for not rounding up to 100, but
it's close.
There isn't anything in the Jewish world where there's 90% agreement on.
It's very anti-Jewish to have so much agreement.
Okay, yes, precisely. So 90% say that you can be critical of the Israeli government policies and be pro-Israel. I'll tell you one step further. We did another poll about criticism of the war and how Israel's handling the war. And it was 74% that said you can be critical of how Israel's handling the war in Gaza and still be pro-Israel. So what you are articulating, that is where American Jews are firmly, and they're not still making up their mind on this. This is the firmly held belief.
So back to Mayor Rob's question, I was going to say from my kind of qualitative or we could call it a vibe analysis. I mean, it seems to me that, and this is something that was very frustrating, I think, to the Jewish establishment leadership, but the war, Gaza, really became a proxy for a panoply of complaints of the left and the young. I actually saw this in the banner of the protest this week, which is, it's like, said something about Palestinian rights, and then it's got like healthcare and abortion, the economy, and you talk to protesters about it. And I think I started to think about the protests in the spring as really a collective kind of scream about everything that people felt was wrong with the country. And I think it turns out that Biden was a big part of what those people were feeling. And I think it was both about disappointments with Biden, his policy towards Israel, but also other things about Biden, and also a scream about the fact that they thought he was going to lose and that they thought he was holding on to power and was going to, deliver the country back to Trump. So it feels to me like the energy behind that kind of scream has really gone out. The air has gone out of the balloon on that since the ticket switch. And I think that really comports with what you're saying about the numbers. So to the extent that people really care about the war, but always we're gonna probably vote based more on other issues, those other issues were part of the anti-war movement a few months ago. I'm not sure that that is as resonant today. And I definitely think that Kamala Harris, being a woman of color, is a champion, the leading champion on the abortion rights thing for the Democrats, is a big part of that. Those are two really big motivating factors for that movement, the people in that movement alongside Gaza. And I just think that it's a real tension between those feelings. So I feel like the numbers are just not gonna follow suit if the trajectory continues in this same way.
So I want to start to get to some of the questions that I'm getting online, and it's hard to talk about 2024 elections, Israel, the Jewish community, without talking about the role that AIPAC has played in this election. Probably the number one independent political spender in the Democratic primary season that's just about over at this point was AIPAC. And while the issue of Israel and the war may not show up as a voting issue, it certainly is an issue that motivated a very large sum of money to be spent in Democratic primaries. And there are a couple of primaries in particular where candidates that were targeted by AIPAC's PAC were defeated. And I'm curious whether you happen to be polling in either the Bowman-Latimer race or in the Bush-Bell race or not, or if you saw any data, whether or not this issue played a role in the actual vote, and whether or not the money that was spent by AIPAC to defeat two of the more vocal critics on the way to the left of J Street, I'll say, but legitimate voices in the political debate, whether or not that money actually made a difference. I'm curious what your take would be on that as well.
Okay, so first of all, the money does make a difference. Okay, campaigns, especially a House race in a primary where you need, there's not gonna be a lot of free media attention the way you have in a presidential general election. The money that people are donating to campaigns makes a difference. Now, how was that money used? It was not one ad was on Israel. It was generally, and we were not polling in the race, but I was observing these very closely, and the television ads against the Democratic incumbents were about how they weren't supportive enough of Joe Biden and how they weren't good Democrat. It was, so the issue, and look, I don't credit AIPAC with much. I think they are a very bad force out there on this issue in our politics and on a range of things. But I will say that they set out to do something in those two races and they succeeded. And our side of this debate should do the same. It should be a wake-up call, because it's going to strike some fear into members of Congress who don't want to be targeted. Now, they did pick easy targets.
Right,
Okay,
that's what I was going to say. I mean, wouldn't you agree? And I'm curious what you would say. My thinking is, I could have told you 8 months ago, before a dollar was spent by anybody, what the outcome of those two races was going to be. And if I were the other organization in this case, and I would look for two easy places to put some money and then say, look what we did, those would have been the two races. And I think in my team, we discussed this, 8 months ago and said, these are the races you would pick. So I don't even know that the money made a difference.
They are races, you're right, they were the easy races, and you can tell out by the races they chose not to go into. That's important. But no, I think the money makes a difference. And maybe, I don't remember the result in the Bush race, but it was closer than the Bauman race.
Yeah.
And Bauman had Bowman said.
We want to get less.
Bowman had a lot of issues.
Right,
that
I mean, Bowman's
invited
district is a
for-
very complicated district, and he, you know, there are many ways in which he did not seem to represent the strongest voting parts of the district in a kind of direct way.
It was redistricted too.
And it was
a different
right.
district that he first got elected in.
But look, I think that to say the money didn't have a huge effect, I mean, is to sort of really underestimate the power of incumbency. I mean, you know, without that money, a challenger in a primary has an incredibly uphill battle there
And may not have run.
and may not have run, right? So
That's
I
really
do
important.
think, I mean, right, I feel like you know, there's a lot of ways in which AIPAC has really changed in the last 5 years, and, you know, it doesn't no longer holds a public policy conference. I mean, it is not really a sort of as much of a mainstream Jewish group as it once was. But it is certainly continued to prove in this cycle, and we should include Andy Levin as a victim of AIPAC money too. That, you know, you do not want to run against an AIPAC candidate in a primary. You will get, it's really
So-
risky. And it's, so the two things we should talk about are, one, you know, they didn't choose to try to primary Ilhan Omar. And number two, I think what we're seeing from AOC in New York is really, really interesting. So first of all, she comes out this spring with this very strong statement about anti-Semitism after the vandalism in New York of the hostage exhibit. And then again, last night, she's the first person to talk about the hostages. So I think that, you know, she's a much stronger candidate than Bowman or Bush were in their districts. But I think she is also saying, like, you know, I do not want to be primaried by AIPAC.
But it's, I mean, I also want to just note that the center of the Democratic Party, which is like 90% of Democrats, right, is not where these folks are. These are real outliers. And people in the center of the party support Israel. They support its security. They want to make sure that it isn't run into the sea by Iran and its proxies. And at the same time, they don't want to see the settlements expand. They don't want to see the occupation continue. That's the mainstream.
They worry that the pro-Palestinian left is anti-Semitic.
And you can take those positions, like everything I just outlined, you can take those positions and not have to worry, because there is a very large base of support for folks like that. It is not the mainstream folks in the middle of the party who are critical of Netanyahu and critical of the occupation who need to be afraid to speak out publicly.
I completely agree with that. Yes, someone who works with dozens and dozens of candidates. I completely agree that there is a large space that you can be in that's not going to invite that kind of money after you. And that is where the J Street candidates tend to be and where they are. So I think that we just have to be cognizant of, you're going to need to educate candidates and remind them of that, because there is going to be, people are going to look at what happened and draw conclusions from it. You need to make sure that they don't draw the wrong conclusions.
So let's shift gears now. We've talked a lot about the impact of this issue on politics and the impact on elections and polls and all of that. Now flipping it, what is the impact of politics on policy, right? What did all of everything that we've just been discussing, what does that mean for what, let's break it into 3 time periods. There's 11 weeks between now and election day, and President Joe Biden has to try to bring this conflict to a close and achieve a deal that frees the hostages, ends the fighting, and surges aid. What is his freedom to operate, and how does the election affect that? Then there's the period of time when, God willing, Kamala Harris will be the president-elect. Joe Biden will be a lame duck. And between November 5th and January 20th, he has a little bit of room there to do some things that maybe a newly elected President Harris may not want to do. So that's the second period. Is there a lame duck period? And does that give the United States some flexibility to do some things policy-wise when there's little political cost to the incumbent? And then what does it mean on January 21st for a Kamala Harris administration? Given what happened in this election cycle, what does it do to her flexibility on this issue? So 3 different questions essentially. You are, you've been in Jerusalem, you've
Yeah.
been covering this issue for decades.
We can talk about what the Democrats want and what they'll try to do, what their leverage is, but we shouldn't forget about the two other parties here. Benjamin Netanyahu, who has approximately zero motivation to change his policy because he believes, and it is correct, that, when this war ends, his political future is likely also ending. And Hamas, which is a terrorist organization whose we cannot, rely on any kind of rationality from them at the negotiating table. So, it is not up to Joe Biden or Tony Blinken or Kamala Harris when this war ends. They can work hard on it. But they don't control it. I certainly think that, the best thing that could happen for Democrats would be to be able to announce a deal tomorrow or Thursday, or actually maybe it would be better if it was next week, so they get their convention bump and then another bump. I don't, and certainly, I'm sure Kamala Harris would desperately like this war to be over before she would take office if she were elected. And Joe Biden, who obviously has had a very rough last couple of months, would sorely like to have this, some kind of a deal be cement his legacy and be part of his legacy. I am a huge West Wing fan, as I think you are as well, Jeremy. And I always think of a lot of what I know about politics comes from watching the West Wing. And you may remember that I think in season 7, there was, I forget exactly what the foreign policy issue is, but Santos, the newly President-elect Santos, and lame duck President Bartlett created this little subterfuge to confuse the foreign leader and acted as though they had differences in policy, and that the foreign leader should take the Bartlett deal because Santos would be tougher on him if he waited till he took office, and it worked beautifully. So maybe
That's exactly
maybe the lame duck period is where to go.
I think it's a really interesting question, and we have a little bit of a track record on this with Bill Clinton.
Right.
And how he did not stop, even though he had his vice president on the ticket, and even though and that person ended up losing, well, depends on how you look at it, but he ended up, it was dragged out, and Clinton kept going up until inauguration day. So presidents can do it and they can push, and I think Biden is probably of that same ilk of wanting, this is about, he's the president of the United States. And now, same thing though, as you said, you've got counter pressures from the region that make it, you can't force them to do it. But I do think that Netanyahu, up until 3 weeks ago, was banking on a Trump presidency and was going to run out the clock. And now he's got to recalibrate. Now, obviously, his first priority is staying in power. And it's not just me. Israelis believe this. All the data says that they think he's doing this for political purposes. I don't think, but I think he's got to recalibrate now.
But Tony Blinken, sitting in his office yesterday, had a lot more credibility and power and leverage than he had a month ago sitting in his office. There's no question. So the politics influences the policy without question. The other thing about the West Wing scenario, just want to remind folks, 1988, George H.W. Bush is the president-elect, and Ronald Reagan in December of 1988 recognizes the PLO, right? It's a move that Ronald Reagan before November of 1988 would never have done, right? But he does it to make it possible for the PLO to be at the Madrid conference that James Baker had been cooking up in his mind all throughout, even while Reagan was president. And so you did have an actual historical precedent there where you had this use of the lame duck period by the incoming team to do something that the incoming team didn't want to do itself. And so I do think there's something to be thought about. If we are in the position where we have an incoming Harris administration, how do you use that period of time with the Biden team to perhaps do some things that are necessary to set the table for the incoming administration? I don't think that's just Hollywood fiction. I think that's actual, and you and I enjoy having these off the record speculative conversations, but
I think we're on record.
right, but this is one we should take offline and talk more about. We'll give everybody else the insight after it all happens.
Okay, great. We'll say it was exactly how we talked about
Exactly.
it. Right.
All right, so we are coming towards the end of the hour. I just want to say it's been great to do this in front. I don't know that I've ever done a Zoom in front of a computer with an office video and a live crowd, and it's just been a lot of fun to do it this way.
You're handling the tech beautifully.
So this is a great setup, and thank you very much. But I want to give you guys the last word here. There's a couple of minutes left, and so maybe just turn to each of you to see if you have any final thoughts about this convention, about what the next few days are going to be like, and what the outcome is going to be on November 5th. Tell us what it's going to be.
I think we are in a great, we've had a great few weeks. We're having a great convention, and it's going to be a tough fight to the end. And everybody out there in the J Street community has a job to do.
And the forward community.
The forward community,
In a
the
nonpartisan
readers,
kind of way.
right, to absorb the.
Let's read and share our journalism.
But I think it is a close election. It is obviously a critical election for the country, but on this issue as well. And there's just a fight ahead to quote some person, when we fight, we win. Right.
I think I heard that one last night.
I guess what I'm thinking most right now is really about tone. This has been a really, really challenging year for American Jews, for Jews around the world, for rabbis, for Jewish organizations like J Street, for Jewish journalists like those at the Forward. I think we've experienced loss that we, had never knew, starting with the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust, and then watching so much devastation in Gaza, and then so much repercussions here at home. It's been a really, really hard and painful year. And now we have in Kamala Harris, this candidate who is trying to really shift the tone to one of joy and celebration. And we also have in Donald Trump, a candidate who's talking about how horrible America is and how, it's the 1930s all over again. And I think that I'm thinking also, like, for Jews, we're coming into the month of Elul and the time of reflection, and then our high holidays. And I think it's going to be a really interesting challenge for us to balance all the feels. How do we feel about our position, about our Jewishness, about our government, about Israel? I think there's a lot of complexity there. And there's a lot of people trying to say it should be one thing or it should be the other thing. You either have to be here or you have to be there. And obviously there's an election and you're gonna have to decide who to vote for. But I feel like I just wanna encourage people to feel all the feels and grapple with the complexity. And you can be really, really worried about what's happening in Israel and Gaza, and also really either excited or not excited about a political candidate.
Yeah, I think one of the key messages that J Street really echoes of Kamala Harris is this need to move beyond the binary on the issues that we care about, that there is truth on several sides here, and the solution to these problems isn't going to be found at one of the extremes. It's only going to be found towards the middle. There's going to have to be some element of some element of both, getting beyond the binary. And I believe that is the natural instinct of Kamala Harris. And I think for us, we didn't talk a lot about Donald Trump. We didn't utter his name that much in this setting, which makes me happy. But it is just vital to remember that is the choice that we do face when it comes to November. And J Street, I'll just say to our J Street audience, and it'll be heard by the Forward audience, and it's just an opinion. But J Street's all in, and I hope everybody understands that we are all in on this race. We are the largest organizational bundler for the Harris Walz campaign in the organized Jewish community. And we will continue to raise money. We will continue to be active on the streets. We will continue to have our people involved in the campaign. And I hope that we will help to ensure that she has the congressional majorities that she needs in the Senate and the House to back up a successful presidency, not just on our issue, but for the entirety of her agenda. So I want to say thank you again to the Dykman Law Firm, to the folks who are here in the room with us, to our audience online. Thank you to Jody. Thank you to Jim. It's been a great conversation, and we will see you live from the DNC tonight. And for those of you who are in Chicago, come and say hi when we see you on the street. Take care.